Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Angel Macias. Those are two considerably large portraits of myself, flanking me on either side. That's easily the weirdest part about this whole experience. As I'm standing behind this podium looking out at you folks, I'm beginning to realize that you might outnumber me by like 1 to 2 people. And I really just want to take a moment to say that I would love to meet each one of you individually and shake your hands and kind of put a name and a face to the story and learn more about your paths. But unfortunately, I have a midterm tomorrow and I'm probably leaving later today. I'm going to flail my way to a B- in biology. So I'm going to do the next best thing and talk about myself for like 15 minutes. That's what I'm really good at. But in order to keep this interactive and interesting, there will be like a few portions where I ask you guys to raise your hands, and there will be a part where I ask for some guesses. And without further ado, I guess I should jump into this. But before I really begin, I'd like to ask a quick question. How many of us in here today have taken a course in biology? With a quick show of hands. Pretty well-educated crowd, okay. How many of us today think we could still pass a final exam in biology? It's okay, we're in the same boat. I saw a hand over there. It's confident, okay. So before I continue, I should probably review a quick concept or two for those of us who didn't pay attention or didn't try or maybe just didn't care about that class. Let's talk about evolution. Evolution states that in response to environmental conditions or pressures, certain characteristics will become more beneficial relative to those conditions or pressure. They become more beneficial by endowing the individuals or organisms with these characteristics with higher reproductive success rates or higher survival rates. Now, all this means is that not as beneficial or detrimental characteristics will eventually fade out of prominence and out of a population. In Gestalt, this idea is best known as survival of the fittest. Now, thanks to this idea of survival of the fittest, the framework of the theory of evolution, and the notion of inherited characteristics, we can trace organismal lineage back to the dawn of life and the simplest microorganism. With that said, would any of you kind people in the first 2 rows maybe want to raise your hand and give me a guess as to what was the first specialized organ to develop?
The heart?
The heart is a good guess, but that's incorrect.
Can I call a friend? How about the brain?
The brain is also a good guess, Ms. Strack, but it's also incorrect. Can we get one more? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, the lungs. It's also a good guess. No, it's the small intestine. Your lower bowel is the oldest part of you. The part of you that existed prior to any other form or function and can be traced the furthest back in that aforementioned evolutionary lineage. And there are a plethora of ways that we can interpret this information. One way to interpret it would be to consider every other cell, every other tissue, every other organ, every other system, every other part of you, from the integuments coating and insulating you to the erythrocytes coursing through your veins right now, as nothing more than periphery objects, than tools, than ploys, than accessories, to do nothing more to get more food down that tube, or more food down that tube more efficiently. Which, unfortunately, if we think about it, kind of makes sense. Our eyes allow us to identify and visualize palatable species of foods. Our ears allow us to listen to and track prey. Our legs facilitate giving this prey chase, and our hands are nothing more than glorified meat hooks for the purpose of funneling and conveying food down that tube. Now, I don't know about you all, but I think this catch as catch can, what came first, the chicken or the egg sort of mentality about humanity is a little misanthropic. It equates all of human history, human accomplishment, and human activity to nothing more than a visceral avarice, engineered, pursued, and obtained solely for the purpose of appeasing our small intestine. And before I continue on that track, I'd like to take another digression and ask a question. You're not gonna have to raise your hands. It's a rhetorical question. What are we told about single-parent children? What are we told about kids raised in broken homes? What are we told about runaways? What are we told about boys raised without a father? What are we told about people like me? Society tells us that we're troubled students, that we're damaged goods, and that we're unlikely to become productive members of society. Statistics like those from the American Journal of Public Health tell us that we're 11 times as likely to physically or verbally abuse our peers. The US Department of Health and Services tell us that we're 3 times as likely to drop out of high school, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics tells us that we're 4 times as likely to find ourselves in juvenile detention centers or psychiatric hospitals. All of these truths and the preconceived notions that they come packaged with are contradicted and negated daily by the work and existence of individuals like yourself. By the work and existence of individuals like my friend, Mr. Casey Gwynn, president and co-founder of the National Family Justice Center Alliance, and my friend who tells us that we can either love these kids at 10 or 11, or we can lock them up at 17 and 18. Over the past decades, Mr. Gwynn and his associates have spent incalculable amounts of time and effort and money to ensure that their programs to help others could be enacted. Programs like Camp Hope, which is a week-long summer intensive retreat that takes these kids out of their often vitriolic environments and facilitates seminal convalescence and introduces them to conditions that are far more conducive to producing these good kids. And as Casey mentioned, I attended this camp for the last 3 summers as a counselor, and in retrospect, I probably learned and grew as much, if not more, than any of my campers. And because I'm as evolutionarily disillusioned, judgmental, and selfish as the next person, before I met these kids, my kids, I would have seen the statistics on the papers and written them off as bad kids, but they're not bad kids. Frankly, they're not good kids either, because they're amazing people. On paper, there were statistics and attention deficits and disrespect to authority and peers that predicted future convicts and unwed mothers and short life expectancies. But in person, they were just sweet, innocent kids who had a disproportionate burden. What these papers failed to display was the struggle that they exemplified, and the promise and ambition that they espoused. And if I can really quickly share a few stories about some campers who, for the sake of non-disclosure agreements, I will call Gary, Matilda, Robert, and Chris. Gary told me he wasn't a very good student, something about not being able to sit still in class and just not focus for too long. But he told me he really liked stars. So for the next week, whenever I had free time, I would sit with Gary and talk about the life cycles of stars and Schwarzschild radii and black holes and spaghettification and cosmology. And by the end of the week, he hadn't gleaned that much, but he told me that he wanted to go back to school, that he knew he had to do better in school because he wanted to go to college unlike his parents, and he wanted to discover amazing things and do great things while studying astrophysics. Gary was 9. And then there was Matilda, who lived in a home whose walls only served as a constant reminder of the terrible things that her father put her and her mother through. But at camp, she was presented with a Congress that was willing to listen and understand and be compassionate, and by the end of the week, her tic, a delicate haiku flinch that presented itself whenever anyone near her raised an open palm, had vanished. By the week's end, she stopped trying to hide those bruises sloppily stapled into her thighs and upper arms and told us that they were no longer flaws, but they were memories of where she'd come from and where she'd been and why she so badly wanted to be a family therapist. Matilda was 14. And then there was Robert, who prior to coming to camp had been released from a juvenile detention center about a week or 2 earlier, and informed us all that prior to coming to camp, he had only been sober and free of hard substances like heroin and God knows what else for a month or 2. Robert, who informed all of us that at the beginning of camp, his biggest goal, his life ambition, was not dying before seeing 18. But at the end of camp, after being surrounded for a week by people who didn't see him as a defect or a failure, but as a friend and a person, Joel said his biggest goal was getting his life back on track and finishing school so he could come back and be a counselor and teach his peers that they're not failures and that people from terrible circumstances can improve and can change. Robert was 14. And lastly, there was Chris. Chris, who came to camp fraught and disillusioned over the imminent divorce of his parents and the constant bickering that his house afforded him. Chris, who for some reason or other found blame in himself for the situation at home and had decided and was all but willing to take his own life. Chris, who came to camp unwilling to share his story, but eventually did and found consolation in individuals like Mr. Gwynn. Chris has since started therapy. He's now attending college as a neuroscience major. Rocks a pretty decent GPA and studies to become a pediatrician so he can one day work with kids all the time. Chris didn't know if he'd make it to C17, is now a week from 19, and stands before you today. There are still people who give themselves to lost causes like that of troubled youth. There are still people who decide to ignore misanthropy, to not heed statistics, and instead give humanity a chance. By putting on these programs, there is no argument that can be made to say that Mr. Gwynn is fulfilling some kind of primordial evolutionary selfishness. And by doing the work you all do, I don't feel that you are providing lunch to or by any other means appeasing your small intestines. If anything, the giving of your effort or time for the benefit of others ignores this instinctive animalistic need to appease the small intestine and simultaneously rejects this misanthropic interpretation of humanity. Now, I'm fairly certain I know the answer to all these questions, but with another quick showing of hands, how many of us here today have given our time or money to causes or organizations? How many of us here today have shared food, either by way of a canned food drive or breaking bread with a hungry friend? And lastly, how many of us here are willing to give our time or our effort or our money or our property or our blood for causes larger than ourselves? I expected to see all your hands, and I think I did, so you're predictable. No, that right there, that ability to give oneself for the benefit of others is community service. But to finally ask myself a question, why does any of this matter? And I'd like to be a little redundant and answer this question twice, once on a personal individual level and then once on a general, like, humanistic level. Folks, if it wasn't for the work of wonderful professionals like yourselves, I wouldn't be on this stage today. I would not be attending a fantastic four-year university, and my biggest concern right now would not be that B-. I'm totally going to get in that biology midterm. Ladies and gentlemen, my one family heirloom is a hand-me-down, round-the-bottle, blue-collar recipe that has infallibly produced generations of field laborers turned old souls. Without Mr. Gwynn's preemptive interventions, by now, I'd be halfway to alcoholic with bounced alimony checks and a second kid on the way. I'd be driving a musty red 1996 Saturn SC2 with the right half of the front bumper broken to a dead-end job that gave me minimum wages to continue leading a life I regretted. Before individuals like you all came into my life, I was angry and misguided and frankly, a little hopeless. I was destined to repeat and own up to my father's mistakes and lead a life of incorrigible moral destitution. And the only reason I share any of this is because when I go to camp and see young men and boys alike swear that they'll never so much as raise their hand at a woman, or when young girls and women promise that they will be strong and never allow anyone to convince them that they're undeserving of kindness or love, I see rehabilitation. I see cycles ending. And I'm not trying to say that we found some panacea with Camp Hope. I'm just thanking you all, and people like you. I'm thanking you for being so patient, incessantly and unselfishly giving. And I'm thanking you for believing that people like me aren't lost causes. I'm letting you know that your work does just that. It works. If Mr. Burke or Mr. Gwynn or Mrs. Park or Miss Westfall or any of their associates can save me from epitomizing social pariahs at best, or from being a young dead body on the corners of Magnolia and Plaster Streets in Redding, California at worst, then I have an endless faith in the change that any one of you have the potential to create in your own communities. Now, for the general answer. Why does your work, why does community service matter? Plainly stated, community service metaphorically disproves science. It rewrites biology and it rejects misanthropy. Because no other species is willing to give itself in its entirety, unselfishly for the benefit of others, without expecting degrees of reciprocation or some amount of direct benefit yielded unto itself. Anything great humanity has ever accomplished or will accomplish is rooted in community service and in the giving of oneself to others. From art, which has always done more for the audience and society than it will do the artist, to government, which historically has done more for the governed than the governing, to revolution, which we all know will do more for posterity and progeny than the founding fathers. War, genocide, arson, and larceny are all terrified of being photographed because they have to be compared to the benevolent altruism that is community service. Community service that is unfortunately too often thought to be only synonymous with grandiose and punctuated examples of donation or charity, when in reality, it's a lot smaller. It isn't always glamorous or big. It's local. It's inherently communal. Community service, the best act of community service is teaching our kids that they're not broken, that their hands may be small, but they can hold and they can fix the world. Community service matters because at the end of the day, it separates theory from reality, man from beast, and it is at the very basis of what it means to be human. Thank you very much.